Story 1. I had a toe amputated because of diabetes, and during the procedure they must have cut or irritated a nerve. The pain was excruciating and no pain medication helped. It lasted almost a month, and I seriously considered suicide because the pain was so severe. Story 2. Kidney stones. I suddenly woke up with the most intense pain in my lower back and urinary area and was covered in sweat. I woke up moaning loudly. I tried to limp to the toilet to urinate but could not. The last thing I remember is sitting on the toilet. Then I woke to my mother screaming for me to wake up. My head was pounding and I was somehow in the bathtub. I had blacked out from the pain and apparently fainted, landing in the tub. Story 3. When I was 32, I was diagnosed with stage 3, advanced, aggressive cancer. I underwent 3 major 6-hour surgeries, developed a severe wound infection, and endured chemotherapy and radiation. At the time, I thought nothing could be more painful until my intestines stopped moving. I was hospitalized for 3 months. For 39 days, I was not allowed to eat or drink anything by mouth. Instead, I survived on a feeding line, a nasogastric tube, and 3 intravenous sites delivering various medications. To manage the pain and keep me sedated, I was given 3 milligrams of hydromorphone every 2 hours injected directly into butterfly needle sites in my shoulder. The typical maximum dosage is 2 to 4 milligrams every 4 to 6 hours. Even when I was unconscious, they continued administering the hydromorphone. It was relentless. Story 4. Intensity. A cluster headache lasted several minutes. It is technically called a complex migraine. I ended up on the ground, writhing in pain so hard that I hurt myself. Length. Losing my 2 daughters in a car crash. It has been 6 years and it is just as raw and painful as the day it happened. Story 5. In 1980, I was working as an industrial millwright at an aluminum smelter. I was told to remove the valve stem from a hot 600-degree 6-inch therminal line. The line was supposed to be empty, but it was not. On the last bolt, the handle slipped and hot oil sprayed all over me. I suffered 22% second and third-degree burns. I always thought that was the worst pain until our beautiful daughter passed away from breast cancer 4 years ago. Story 6. I received the 3 a.m. phone call from my mother informing me that my father had passed away. Story 7. Inflammation of the middle ear in adulthood. If someone had offered to euthanize me, I probably would have asked them to. Story 8. I sat in the emergency room for 40 minutes with kidney stones, while the nurses decided whether I was seeking pain medication. Story 9. The death of my son and later losing contact with my stepson have both been painful. Being forgotten hurts some days as much as his death. Story 10. My appendix nearly burst. I felt pain across my body and was vomiting uncontrollably. My surgeon said this was because my appendix was 2.5 times larger than normal, so the pain was not localized. Drowsy from dilaudid. I said hey aloud, which caused the resident surgeons accompanying the attending to leave the room because they were laughing so hard. Story 11. Cluster headaches. They do not call them suicide headaches for nothing. Story 12. Getting an intrauterine device. I thought I knew about pain before that. Now I see even that is just barely scratching the surface. Story 13. Physical pain. I have polycystic ovary syndrome and sometimes during my menstrual cycle I experience such intense cramping that I curl into the fetal position, crying and wishing I could reach in and pull out my uterus. Emotional pain. Loneliness at my lowest point. I have had 2 times when I needed someone to talk to because I felt I was spiraling with my mental health and had very few people to reach out to. Those people were not there for me. This led to me crashing for days, deleting my social media accounts, and withdrawing from everyone while I worked on regaining my balance. I considered checking out during those times, but I have children and the idea of them not having me anymore felt worse, so I am still here. Story 14. Sciatica. If it is severe, it feels like you have been tossed and cannot move. Story 15. I had viral meningitis when I was 19. It caused immense pressure in my skull. I could not move my eyes because the pain was so severe. The headache was immobilizing. I was placed in a quarantine room in the hospital. They gave me painkillers intravenously, but they did nothing for the pain. However, once they took a spinal fluid sample, the pain disappeared in the most blissful way. Story 16. The emotional pain hurt more than giving birth. It made me bitter and angry. Story 17. I am recovering from my rotator cuff surgery. Fuck that shit. Story 18. A 6 mm kidney stone is stuck in my right ureter. It is worse than childbirth. Story 19. An ovarian cyst burst inside me. I didn't even know I had one. It burst in the middle of the night and I was doubled over in pain. I went to the hospital thinking my appendix had ruptured because of pain on the right side, and I was brought in immediately as I was showing signs of shock. After 13 hours and an ultrasound, I was sent home when the cyst dissolved back into my body. It happened only once in June last summer. It was the scariest experience I have ever had. Story 20. Mountain biking accident. I slipped going downhill and my crotch slammed onto the crossbar. So much blood ran down my legs and I was in shock, so the pain had not kicked in yet. I was rushed to the emergency room and discovered my left labia majora had started swelling significantly. That was when the pain began, getting sharper every minute. The doctor said I needed stitches, but because of the swelling they could not administer any anesthetic. The nurse held my hand and comforted my 19-year-old self, saying that compared to this pain, childbirth would be a breeze. I received stitches in my already very painful genital area without pain medication. I was sent home with pain medication, thankfully, but the story did not end there. A few days later, I had surgery to relieve the massive swelling. Thank goodness, because I was in so much pain I could hardly move. It all ended up okay. And now it is just a funny story to me. Story 21. Testicular torsion. I passed out at school and had to have emergency surgery the same day. Story 22. I had all my upper teeth removed and a bone graft along the entire upper gum line. I have experienced intense, deep dental pain. Story 23. I tore my anterior cruciate ligament and my meniscus at the same time. The torn meniscus became trapped in the knee joint and blocked movement. Every small motion was extremely painful. I had surgery the following morning to remove the trapped meniscus. My anterior cruciate ligament was reconstructed in a second surgery. Story 24. I had my wisdom teeth removed when I was 16. They were still inside the gums and their roots were not fully formed, but the teeth were already angled 45 degrees relative to the rest of the jaw. If they had started growing, the consequences would have been terrible, but we were lucky to spot that on an X-ray. An X-ray was taken because braces were being considered for another reason, and my parents immediately took me to the dentist. The dentist had to perform minor surgery to cut the gums, remove the teeth, and stitch everything back. For teeth were removed. The extractions were done in 2 visits with a break to allow my gums to heal so I could chew on that side. I took a lot of painkillers that summer. The dentist said this happened because of genetics. I inherited large teeth and a small jaw, so there was no room for the wisdom teeth and they began to turn. Story 25. Alcohol withdrawal. I went to the emergency room and my blood alcohol content was 0.526. I woke up 2 weeks later after being intubated and suffering multiple organ failure. My whole family had flown up to say goodbye because they did not think I would make it. I developed intensive care unit delirium and experienced severe hallucinations. I threw myself out of bed because I decided I did not want my breathing tube and nasogastric tube anymore. I learned a nasogastric tube is secured with a magnet, which I broke, and I ended up in restraints. I was on maximum doses of medication, but nothing could calm me down. The existential dread of knowing it might not get better the next minute or even the next day was indescribable. And after all that, I still drank again. Late-stage addiction is purely bleak like nothing else I know. Story 26. The first bowel movement after I gave birth was awful. I had been constipated for weeks and was pretty torn up. My butt puckers just thinking about it. Story 27. The worst pain I've ever experienced was stepping on a Lego brick barefoot in the middle of the night. Half asleep and completely unprepared, it felt like the universe decided my soul needed to meet the sharpest edge of existence. A small piece of plastic delivered a pain so sharp I almost questioned life itself. Story 28. My epidural failed suddenly when I was 9.5 centimeters dilated and on the maximum dose of Pitocin, so I had to receive a spinal block for an urgent cesarean section. The pain of trying to sit still while experiencing full-blown contractions every minute to a minute and a half was the absolute worst. Story 29. Intrauterine device insertion and removal made tearing my anterior cruciate ligament feel like a tickle. Story 30. I broke my tibia and fibula while kickboxing. He checked my kick and it snapped. I required 2 surgeries, a metal rod, and months of physical therapy. That being said, I had a dental abscess that was unbearable and made me cry. Story 31. The day I came home from prison, my family told me my brother had been murdered 2 months earlier. Story 32. Physical or mental? Physical. My leg twisted until it snapped. Mental. I dug my own son's grave. That hurt. Story 33. The pain of knowing that your entire family has died during the holidays. Story 34. I told my girls that their mother had suddenly passed away. They were 9 and 11 years old. It felt like looking at death itself. Story 35. I had a pilonidal cyst that did not seem severe, but the pain was unlike anything I had experienced. One night I could not stand it and, in desperation, I cut it out myself. I survived with minimal damage. There was a lot of blood and pus, but the relief after it was removed was incredibly intense. Story 36. First, my 16-year-old sister's suicide and having to tell my mother and 14-year-old brother. Next, my finger being smashed and amputated at work, followed by 2 subsequent surgeries. Is this what you meant? Story 37. I was a paratrooper in the Army stationed at Fort Bragg. I broke my back during a parachute malfunction. I hit the ground with my lumbar area first and then cracked my head. A bright white light and loud ringing and buzzing filled my ears so I could not even hear myself scream. I had to stop screaming and just groan, because screaming does not feel good when one of your vertebrae is fractured and you have a serious concussion. I had about 3 seconds before impact to have the whole revelation about mortality and life, and I was not exaggerating when I muttered, "Are you kidding me?" I made a full recovery after about 6 months and completed another 20 jumps after the accident. I still have recurring night terrors related to the incident, but it always makes me laugh a little because I still say, "Are you kidding me?" in the dream, laughing my ass off. I left the service in 2017 after completing my contract. Story 38. I was trying to break up a fight between 2 people. I pulled the larger man off the smaller one. As I twisted to my left, my boot caught a nail head sticking out of the floorboard. My whole body turned, but my left foot remained pointing forward. I completely snapped my fibula. I looked down and saw my left foot turned 180 degrees the wrong way. 0 out of 10. I would not recommend that pain to anyone. A close second was diverticulitis. I would not recommend that either. Story 39. Existential grief feels like there is an actual hole in your heart. You genuinely feel it. Story 40. I had a cyst in my armpit that was wrapped around a nerve. I could not move my arm for several weeks, hoping it would heal on its own, but it did not. I went to the hospital and they gave 5 injections of Novocaine, but it barely touched the pain. The doctor opened the cyst and squeezed it to drain it. The pain was so intense that I faded in and out of consciousness on the table. The doctor packed the wound with gauze to promote internal healing. A couple of days later, I tried to remove it myself and passed out again. A friend came over and pulled the gauze out for me. It was the most painful thing I have ever experienced. Before this, I had a cesarean section. As they stapled me closed after the baby was delivered, they hit a nerve. I was numb, so I only felt an odd jolt and my whole body trembled. I had no feeling there for a while, but when the staples were removed, I realized what had happened. 12 years later, scar tissue still sometimes wraps around the nerve. About once a year, I have to lie down and move the scar in a certain way to release the tissue from the nerve. It is not as painful as it was initially, but I had no idea this would be an issue more than a decade later. Story 41. Dry socket following extraction of a wisdom tooth. The nerve has been exposed for 7 days. Story 42. waking up from surgery to find out I have a genetic immunity to opioids. That was a fun experience. Story 43. I took my mother to the emergency room for the last time on my birthday. They asked the standard question, "Do you know what today's date is?" She correctly gave the date and was close on the other questions. Late that evening, I asked her if she knew what today's date was. She repeated it. Finally, I asked if she remembered when my birthday was. The look of shock when she connected the dots still visits me. My birthday isn't the same anymore. I was asked to sign my mother's "do not resuscitate" order on her behalf. The soul-crushing realization that the end of her life was near felt like being asked to sign her death warrant. Honestly, it still does, deep down. Just acknowledging this makes my stomach hurt. Then I spent the next 2 weeks giving her medications prescribed by home hospice every 30 minutes. Around the clock. That, to some extent, makes me feel like I was poisoning her. While dealing with that, my stepchildren made things worse. The days leading up to my mother's passing were especially hard. Her outbursts were intense. The only answer seemed to be more medication, which fed the loop of feeling like I was drugging her to keep her quiet. I charted every dose. My primary care physician reviewed them with me and assured me I was not overdosing or poisoning her. But some days it still feels that way, and I cannot shake it. I am so very sorry, Mom. Story 44. My lower lumbar joint, right at the base of my spine, exploded. It took 3 surgeries to clean it up. When it first happened, I woke up and could not move my leg off the bed. The pain was excruciating and I would pass out. My abusive husband did not take me to the hospital for 5 hours. It was agony. I went in and out of consciousness. When he carried me to the car, the pain was almost unbearable. I lay on the floor for hours in the emergency room. After a computed tomography scan, I was immediately rushed into surgery. It took hours to clean up what they could. I never fully regained feeling in my lower right leg because of nerve damage. I eventually had to get an artificial disc and a spinal cage. I hope no one ever has that kind of pain. It changed me forever. Story 45. My appendix ruptured on a 3rd grade field trip. The chaperones did not want to take me to the hospital without consulting my parents, and no one could reach either of them. I was in pain for 2 to 3 hours. Story 46. When I was in 6th grade, I started busing to a magnet school on the other side of my city. I did not take a yellow school bus. I rode regular city buses and had to transfer. At 11 years old, I was not very familiar with my surroundings for most of the journey. I knew to take the bus in front of my house, get off at the halfway point and wait for the next bus, then get off that second bus at my school. The process was the same coming home. One December day, I left the house wearing only a jacket because it was in the low 50s and I expected it to warm up in the afternoon. I had detention and had to take the late bus home. The temperature plunged into the 20s and it began to snow heavily. Between being late and the bad weather, I did not get to my downtown transfer until around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. It was already getting dark, and I was freezing. Buses usually ran every 15 minutes, so I waited. 15, then 20, then 30 minutes passed and still no buses. They had been shut down because of the weather. The city did not handle snow well. At that point, I decided to try walking the route my bus took. I was covered in snow, soaking wet, and freezing. I had a pair of Dr. Martens boots made of thin leather, not suitable for snowy conditions, and I was not wearing thick socks. Snow got inside the boots and my feet became wet, making everything worse. I tried to call my parents from a payphone, but they were not home from work yet. I ended up walking about 2 miles home, frozen to the bone. I second-guessed myself the whole way because it was dark and I had never walked home from that far away before. At one point, the snow turned into sleet and freezing rain and I took shelter in some bushes. I was exhausted, miserable, and losing hope. I wondered if I would die from exposure. A businesswoman walking down the street took pity on me and gave me her umbrella. That act gave me the strength to get up and keep walking. I always wonder what would have happened if she had not stopped. By the time I got home, my parents had arrived and were worried sick. They were relieved I was okay but shocked at my condition. I was turning purple, my lips were blue, and my body temperature was dangerously low. This story is about pain. All that cold was painful, and when I finally sat down next to the heating vent and peeled my half-frozen socks off my blue feet to warm up, I felt a growing ache. As I rubbed my ice-cold feet and hands, drying them and wrapping them in a blanket, the ache turned into serious pain, as if my feet were being compressed in a vice. Finally, the pain became an excruciating, unending sensation I had never felt before. It was like my feet had been smashed with a giant anvil and the moment of impact froze in time. I writhed in a chair, grabbing my feet and screaming in agony for about 15 to 30 minutes. I just wanted the pain to stop. My father, normally unmoved by much, was visibly shaken by my reaction. By the end of it, I was half-conscious from exhaustion. I learned a very important lesson that day. Do not let your extremities get cold. Story 47. Diverticulitis was pretty bad but ultimately tolerable. A dry socket after wisdom tooth removal made me want to end my life to stop the pain. That was more than 10 years ago, but every time I have dental work I always ask whether there is a risk of dry socket. Story 48. Physical pain. A compound distal clavicle fracture, type 2A, sustained while playing American football. The sharp point of the broken bone impaled my trapezius muscle. Not cool. Story 49. I was cleaning the wall behind a deep fryer at work when my hand slipped, and I deep fried my hand up to my forearm. The pain was almost as bad as my knee replacement, which I could only describe as medieval, like bone splitting. Story 50. I was holding my dad's hand when he died of lung cancer. I will never unsee that. Story 51. A Bartholin cyst. Do not search the internet for this term if you do not know what it means. Story 52. I don't understand why this is not near the top of these threads. Childbirth results in something beautiful, but even with an epidural it is hours of awful pain. The hormone dump about 6 hours later is also terrible. The sleep deprivation and caring for a newborn while you have not yet recovered is like being tortured. No one seems to care about you, the person who was up for 30 hours straight with no sleep after pushing a whole human out of your body. I would do it all over again to have my daughter, but it is brutal. Story 53. Losing my cat to kidney disease when he was 7 years old was devastating. I had been away at college for a few years, and I believe he became depressed without me and stopped eating and drinking enough. My parents tried to keep him alive with daily intravenous fluids, but he did not recover and we had him euthanized. What hurts most is that I believe if I had been there, he would have lived much longer. Being away at college, watching his health decline, and knowing it was killing him was the most painful period of my life. I felt partly responsible and cried every day for about 3 years. Every lunch break at work, I would go to my car and cry for the entire hour. It has been about 13 years now, and I tear up again as I write this. I have had broken bones and was in a motorcycle accident. I had road rash all over my body and multiple layers of stitches, including internal stitches, but that pain was nothing compared to this. He was my boy. Story 54. Antibiotics were given to me intravenously. The pain during the process, which lasted 1 to 1.5 hours, was excruciating. Story 55. I had an impacted kidney stone. Apparently my right kidney had swollen to 3 times its normal size. I almost lost it. I had basket retrieval surgery and spent a week in the hospital. It took a month before I was urinating normally and having solid bowel movements again. I have torn tendons, broken bones, and even had a perforated colon in the past. Nothing else comes close. 0 out of 10. Do not recommend. Story 56. A pilonidal cyst left a large cavity behind. I was feverish and sweating in the emergency room. Even my infected appendix did not compare to that throbbing pain. No position gave me any relief. Story 57. I would not wish gout on my worst enemy. I would prefer to win the lottery for $100 million or to live the rest of my life without gout. Remove gout. Story 58. Heartache. There is no pain worse than that. I have been through the most aggressive cancer treatments, including chemotherapy. No doubt. Story 59. Physical pain. Fractured my femur twice. Color tattoo on my shoulder. The time I caught an onion using my broken finger. Overdose. Emotional pain. severe depression and suicidal visions each night, coming clean to my wife about my mistakes, having something irreversibly stolen from me, finding out my daughter's quality of life could be extremely low. Story 60. I was betrayed by the one person who was supposed to have my back. She chose the worst possible moment, at the height of the pandemic when people were losing their jobs and their stability, to stab me in the back and try to steal from me. Story 61. Labor pains that lasted 18 hours and the doctors could not decide what to do with me. I was seriously ready to die. It was horrible. Story 62. I prayed to God to take away the pain of losing a loved one. Story 63. I experienced suicidal mood swings. I couldn't concentrate on anything except the bone-deep ache of emotional pain. Nothing could stop or soothe it except time. All I could do was lie on my couch alone, cry, and hope it would pass as it usually did. I'm sorry you're feeling this way. Are you safe right now? If you are in immediate danger, call your local emergency services. If you are in the United States, you can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you are outside the United States, please contact your local emergency number or a crisis hotline in your country, and consider reaching out to someone you trust or a mental health professional. Story 64. Mine feels oddly specific. Getting an intravenous line placed while in active labor. I have difficult veins, and placing the line is always painful. When I was in labor with my second child, it took 6 attempts to place it. The anesthesiologist had to come in and place it himself using an ultrasound machine. My entire labor lasted 5 hours, so approximately 45 minutes after it was placed, my baby was born. The intravenous line was worse than labor itself. Recovery after a hysterectomy in the operating room is not fun. Story 65. Impacted molar. Tylenol 3, acetaminophen with codeine, tetrahydrocannabinol gummies, and extra-strength Advil, ibuprofen, all failed to relieve the pain. I had to have the tooth extracted. Story 66. Emotional pain is a lot worse than physical pain, in my opinion. The deaths of family members, including pets, are the worst pain I have ever felt. In second place is having someone you still love fall out of love with you. Story 67. My dentist cut my tooth in half with a small dental saw to make extraction easier. He stopped halfway because the anesthesia was not working due to an infection. It hurt at the time and it still hurts now. Story 68. I had parts of my esophagus and stomach removed due to cancer. Story 69. The pain you feel from losing a loved one. Physical pain. For me, it was when I had a colonoscopy. Story 70. I experienced back labor when my first and only child was born. Back labor is when a woman feels labor contractions in the back rather than the front. It was constant, shooting pain that never stopped. I had told my doctor up front that I wanted an epidural, but so many people needed emergency cesarean sections that all the anesthesiologists were unavailable. I waited 5 to 6 hours for the epidural. I was screaming and begging for help. It was traumatic. I had considered having 2 children close in age, but I would never put my body through that again. My back is still injured. Story 71. I have a condition called cluster headaches. They are randomly occurring severe headaches concentrated behind one or both eyes. They occur in bursts, hence the name cluster, and are often called suicide headaches because of the severe pain. Story 72. I had severe gastrointestinal pain that worsened over time. At its worst, I was hospitalized for a week with a nasogastric tube to decompress my stomach. The doctors had no explanation. One night, I went to sleep feeling fine and woke up doubled over in pain. I fell out of bed and crawled to the bathroom, but I could neither pass stool nor vomit. Scans were inconclusive, so I underwent exploratory surgery. It turned out my intestines had developed what the doctor described as a rat's nest of scar tissue, which rearranged my bowels and blocked the passage of stool. The cause remains unknown. I could not pass stool for years. The doctor said the pain felt similar to the contractions that occur just before childbirth. Story 73. Punched in the groin twice, a few seconds apart. Story 74. I put a wire through my right eye and caused retinal bleeding at 10 a.m. I was fine for the first few hours, but by the time I went under the knife in the evening, I was climbing the walls from the pain. Story 75. I developed hemorrhoids during pregnancy. The nurse injected them with a needle to numb them. It felt as if my whole body jumped toward the ceiling, like a cat. I still remember that pain during the birth. Story 76. For me, it was being tossed by a police officer's taser. He hit me in the back. I was immediately locked up by 50,000 volts. My calves flexed so hard I thought my muscles would snap. The worst part was that I felt it in my testicles as well. My body turned to wood while at the same time trying to rip itself apart, and my brain instantly wanted it to stop. My testicles felt like they were in a vice, squeezed with both hands. Avoid being tossed if you can. Story 77. I recently had to go to the emergency room after a stricture in my urethra made it impossible to urinate. I was begging them to cut me open. I wanted to die. I screamed on the way to the hospital. Firefighters had to help get me out of bed and carry me out of the house in a bag to the ambulance stretcher. I felt like my bladder was going to burst, and this came after several months of painful urinary tract infections and yeast infections. I did not know pain like that existed. I did not know I could make the sounds I made. Story 78. My intestinal wall was torn. The pain was immediate, as if someone had driven a hot blade through my abdomen. I fell to the ground instantly. Story 79. I completely tore my meniscus and a ligament when I dislocated my knee. Story 80. I have a hairline crack in my pelvis. I know it sounds minor, but I was crying from breathing too hard. Story 81. The loss of an unborn child nearly killed my family in multiple ways. Story 82. I am experiencing right now a sebaceous cyst under my skin on my lower back. It is a skin infection I acquired from training in martial arts. It is about the size of a ping pong ball and is causing severe pain. I cannot walk properly or sleep. In 18 years, this is the worst pain I have had. I am currently on my way to have it drained. Story 83. I have experienced a lot of physical pain, but nothing compares to the feeling of being alone with your significant other right next to you. If you know. Story 84. I broke my hip after a high side crash on my motorcycle, but that was not very painful. The pain started about a week later when I was lying in bed and sneezed. It flexed every muscle in my abdomen and I saw white. I was scared to sneeze for 2 years after that. Story 85. The loss of my first love. I did not even know she wanted someone else. I also think she lied to me. This happened 40 years ago. Story 86. I perforated my large intestine due to a diverticulitis flare. Imagine being about to have the worst diarrhea of your life but nothing comes out. And that sensation never stops, only intensifies, like a searing hot knife trying to rip you open from the inside out. Story 87. A nerve pinch, sciatica, in my lower back. Multiple emergency room visits over 2 months before I could get spinal injections. It was the only time in my life I seriously considered deletion. Story 88. Cole's fracture. I fell backwards and stuck my arm out to catch myself. I broke both bones in my forearm just under the wrist joint. My hand was hanging there, and I had to hold it up with my other hand. I waited in the emergency room for 3 hours before they sedated me and reset it. I begged my husband to punch me and knock me out because I couldn't take the pain anymore. Fun times. Story 89. My ovarian cyst ruptured. I was seriously waiting for a little alien to pop out. Story 90. I jammed my pinky catching a football. It swelled and locked in place. I stupidly thought pulling it back like a dislocated shoulder would fix it. I yanked on it, passed out in the car from the pain, and shattered the knuckle so badly it required surgery. I still cringe thinking about that night. Story 91. I have gallbladder stones. I also had a root canal last week with little to no Novocaine. It was extremely painful, but the gallbladder stones were worse. Story 92. I walked into my home after a 9-month deployment, only to find another man in my bed. 12 years with the woman of my dreams were gone. It still hurts. Story 93. When my father died, it felt as if my heart would stop beating and my tears would not stop. It was more painful than any physical pain. He was not the best man in the world, but he meant a great deal to me. Story 94. I feel unfocused and lost. I'm walking on the road, and when I reach halfway to my destination, I get bored, turn around, go home, and lie in bed. Story 95. Physical, miscarriage. Emotional, my ex cheated on me during the miscarriage. Story 96. The emotional damage of being blindsided by a breakup and a layoff in quick succession. Life said get wrecked. Story 97. Kidney stones. There is no relief from that pain. You just have to ride it out. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.